Listen to me, something very strange is going on in Mount Rainier National Park. Nobody's talking about it, and you deserve to know the truth. Some sources say that over 400 people have vanished just on this one mountain, and while I can't confirm that number, I can show you why many insiders believe it. Take what happened in 2010, for example, when search crews found something that absolutely shocked them right along the summit of Mount Rainier itself. The search team had been climbing for hours in brutal whiteout conditions. The wind and snow had been punishing them up on the summit, and just when they were ready to turn back and call it a day, one of them spotted a small opening in the snow. As the climber approached this mysterious hole on the side of the mountain, it was obvious that this hole was there on purpose. It was almost like he was meant to find it. The climber dropped to his knees and decided to look inside of the hole, expecting to find something horrific like blood, abandoned gear, or even a body. But what he actually found in the hole was arguably far worse and certainly far more baffling. If you're morbidly fascinated with wilderness-related mysteries, please help us reach our goal of hitting 1 million subscribers. I really want 2026 to be the year that we get there, but this is only gonna happen if all of my regular viewers, that's right, I'm talking to you, hit that subscribe button, and a few new viewers join in as well. I appreciate all of you so much, and I need to introduce you to a man named Eric Lewis. Eric was an experienced mountaineer from Duvall, Washington, which isn't too far from Mount Rainier National Park. He was 57 years old, and he had been up and down Mount Rainier multiple times. He was comfortable and skilled in the mountains, but even the most experienced climbers aren't invincible. On July 1st, 2010, Eric joined two of his friends, Don Storm and Trevor Lane, to climb the Gibraltar Ledges route, a historic and demanding way to get up Mount Rainier that has been guiding climbers to the summit for ages. By the early afternoon, the team had almost reached 14,000 feet of elevation, which would put them just a few hundred feet from the mountain summit of 14,410 feet. Now, at this altitude, the winds gradually began to kick up, visibility was decreasing, and as Eric and his friends started looking around, their world started to turn whiter and whiter with snow. And you might be thinking, didn't Kyle just say that this took place in July? Well, yes, it did, but the truth is that whiteouts and snow on a mountain this high, especially on Rainier, all that stuff's common even in the warmest months of the year. Whiteouts on Mount Rainier aren't anything new or unnatural either, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they are absolutely disorienting. Have you ever tried catching snowflakes on your tongue in the winter? You know, should I demonstrate? You know, you go like this. Don't clip that, please. You know, when you're doing this and you look up, you can usually see each individual flake kind of slowly falling down and even track them right into your mouth. But in a bad whiteout like this, you can't even see 6 inches in front of you, and good luck if you're trying to catch those snowflakes on your tongue. It would kind of be like drinking out of a frozen fire hose. That was not my best explanation, was it? So in this moment, Eric's friend Don was lead climbing, but he was essentially just kind of guessing with every step and hoping that his experience on the mountain would come in handy. Sometimes that's just how it goes on these kinds of expeditions. Don stopped for a moment, and he was soon joined by Lane. They had literally just been with Eric moments earlier, and they had felt the steady tension of his weight through the rope right behind them. But still, as they waited a little bit longer for Eric to catch up, they began to worry. And maybe he was right next to them and they just couldn't see him through all the snow. That was certainly plausible, and they reached their arms into the air. They called out his name, but still nothing. And so Lane finally decided to pull on the slack in Eric's rope, but as he did this, he started to realize that he couldn't feel any resistance on the line anymore. One pull after another, his fear began to grow until his hand grabbed onto something that he couldn't quite recognize right away. Again, his vision was blurred in the whiteout conditions, but he pulled the mystery object closer to his face to see the dark truth of what he was holding. It wasn't his friend Eric on the other side of the line. It was just a coil of rope that had been neatly tied off with a butterfly knot. Lane and Don began calling out Eric's name louder and louder off into the snowy abyss, but of course they didn't get any responses. the two men immediately searched the slope below, scanning the snowfields and ledges for any sign of their friend. But they couldn't find any tracks. Zero footprints in the snow. And more concerningly, or I should say bafflingly, is that a word? There were no signs of a slip or a slide. They kept looking, and they went to check the summit ridge above them just in case Eric had somehow moved around them in the whiteout and they didn't see him, but he wasn't up there either. They were exhausted at this point from the climb, the search, all the stress of the situation, and the brutal conditions, and they knew that they had to turn back soon. As they descended to base camp below, they knew that they had no choice at this point but to alert the park rangers of the dark truth, which was that Eric was missing on Mount Rainier. And from that point, the search was on. Climbing rangers, professional guides, and volunteer rescue teams spread out all over the mountain. Helicopters swept the area around the Gibraltar Chute, as well as the surrounding glaciers. Conditions at that altitude were still extremely sketchy, and so every hour that was spent searching came with increasing danger to the search teams themselves. But of course, I mean, everyone knew that time was of the essence here. If Eric was all alone up there, trapped, well, he obviously didn't have much time. But the search dragged on into the night, and by the next morning, July 2nd, ground teams were still searching the mountain at around 13,600 feet, just below where Lane and Dawn first realized that Eric was no longer right behind them. One of those search and rescue climbers was trudging through the deep snow when he stepped on something that didn't quite feel like the normal snow, ice, or rock that he had grown accustomed to. He got chills as he wondered what might be sitting below his boots. What is that? He quickly pushed away the snow, grabbed this unknown object, and pulled on it to get a little bit of a better look. Turns out it was a backpack. As they opened up this pack, they pulled out a climbing harness, a snow shovel, and a couple of full frozen water bottles. Based on all of the background information they had gotten from Dawn and Lane, the searchers knew that this backpack obviously belonged to Eric. Folks, this was the clue that they had been praying for, and so they kept searching all around that same area. I mean, could Eric be literally right around the next corner? Was there some other sign of tracks or of life nearby? They climbed about 200 feet, or roughly 60 meters, further up the mountain, where they found another clue. And this one was by far the most unsettling clue of this entire story. Now, before I tell you what this clue was, I need to tell you about the reason that I'm even able to make these videos every single week. Or actually, there's two reasons. The first is because of my amazing subscribers, and the second is literally because of Drink Element. Element is the sponsor of this video, and they happen to be my longest and most loyal sponsor, and it's not even close. And they also happen to make the best electrolytes on the market, and that also is not even close. Now, despite the fact that I tell all these dark stories about the outdoors, I still do genuinely love going out hiking and camping and doing all these things, although these stories have definitely made me ramp up my safety precautions a little bit, to say the very least, but that's besides the point. Anytime I'm out hiking or camping or doing anything where I'm physically active, even if it's just as simple as shoveling my driveway, you're always gonna find me drinking Element's electrolytes, because when you're sweating, when you're working your body, I mean, yeah, it's important to hydrate and drink a lot of water, but you also need to replace your sodium, your magnesium, your potassium, all your electrolytes. And if you don't, or at least for myself, I've found that I get muscle cramps, I get fatigued, you just don't feel right. And this is why from literally the first time I ever tried Element, I could tell that they were different. They were genuinely the first electrolytes that I drank that actually made me feel hydrated after I drank them, right? I have a pretty good feeling that you're gonna find the same thing. And so what I want you to do is go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or just click that link at the top of the description. When you make a purchase through my link, you are going to get a sample pack of 8 additional Element sticks thrown in with your order for no extra cost. And so you're gonna get some free Element, and you're also just gonna get to sample all of their most popular flavors. One more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. And remember, you're also supporting the channel when you support my sponsors, so I appreciate all of you very, very much. Okay, let's get back to the story. So the search crews were high on Mount Rainier. They're looking for Eric when all of a sudden they found what looked like a carefully constructed hole in the ground. And as they kind of got down to try to peer inside the hole, they started to prepare themselves for the possible horrors that they might find inside. But as they peered their heads inside of the hole, it was completely empty. It was in this moment that they also realized that the hole was actually a carefully constructed man-made snow cave. And if you're not familiar, a snow cave is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a cave dug into the snow that's meant to trap body heat and create a safe haven from blizzards and wind. It's a structure that requires time, strength, and clear judgment to create. And of course, given the fact that the hole was found very close to where Eric's backpack was found, the search crews assumed that this snow cave must have been built by Eric to protect himself from the harsh conditions, and yet there was zero sign of Eric anywhere. The cave was completely abandoned. Crews of more than 40 people searched for multiple days after finding Eric's backpack and that mysterious snow cave, but conditions on Mount Rainier were just not getting any better. After failing to find any additional clues, the search for Eric was eventually scaled back. Now, park rangers did say that they'd continue doing normal patrols, but the official, full-scale search was basically coming to an end, leaving so many unanswered questions, many of which I'm sure you're running through in your heads right now. First of all, why had Eric unclipped himself from the rope? I mean, that's a big question. And some theories around the time suggested that he had possibly become confused due to the cold and, of course, possible hypothermia, and then somehow untied, unclipped, and then retied his rope into that mysterious butterfly knot that his friends kind of reeled in. And I guess I can see how that's possible, especially because from making these videos, I know plenty of examples of how hypothermia makes very rational and smart people do some very unrational and sometimes crazy things. But then again, that just seems like a lot of steps that Eric would have had to go through. I don't know. Now, there's something I haven't really emphasized as much as I think I should have up to this point, and that's the butterfly knot. That is a very weird part of this story because ropes don't just tie themselves up into butterfly knots all by themselves, obviously. Someone had to stop, they had to use their hands, and they had to focus to make this happen. It feels like to me that it would have been almost impossible for Eric to tie that knot in these whiteout conditions that were so bad that he basically couldn't even see his own boots. And so I don't know what to make of that. It just seems really weird to me. But then again, it wouldn't be the first time that I read a story on this channel where something impossible happened, so maybe Eric had badly injured himself while he was in the back of the group's climbing line. Maybe he called out to his friends to try to, have them help him, but the whiteout conditions, the wind, the chaos, everything made it impossible for him to actually get their attention. And then rather than slowing down and endangering the rest of his climbing party, perhaps Eric simply unclipped himself in secret and decided to save his friends from making a dangerous and impossible decision to try to carry him back down the mountain, which, man, talk about a tough position to be in. That theory sounds noble, of course, but it also sounds straight out of a Hollywood movie, at least to me. And in my experience, these stories usually have much darker and scarier endings than that. And of course, if Eric had built the mysterious snow cave, then why wasn't he in there? And why was his backpack, his shovel, and his climbing harness found in a different spot than the snow cave? They were, relatively close together, but you would think that they would be found right next to each other, or all that gear would even be in the cave. I mean, did something go wrong while he was digging the cave that forced him to abandon it in a hurry? Now, there were no signs of a struggle anywhere near the cave or his backpack, and so there's no way to know if someone or something had interrupted Eric as he was attempting to save his own life. My gut is telling me that this more nefarious explanation probably isn't true, but in a park like Rainier, you just never know. Now, as time stretched on, Dawn, Lane, and all of Eric's loved ones hoped for a miracle. Maybe Eric would just kind of emerge from the mountain alive somehow, freezing cold, but alive. Folks, this miracle, obviously never came. And to this day, Eric's story still doesn't have an official end. No one has ever found his body. And frankly, there haven't been any new clues, at least that I'm aware of. Just complete and total silence echoing from the side of Mount Rainier. And as much as it pains me to say this, I kind of feel like this is one of those mysteries that might not ever be solved. And I don't always say that about these stories I cover, but this one, just given how high up he was, given how harsh that environment is, how hard it is to search there, I don't know. It sucks to say, but I just don't have a good feeling that this one's ever going to have any closure. I mean, Eric's case is just so chilling. The mountain didn't just take him. I mean, it showed that he was desperate to survive, and yet still, presumably, he failed. And the next story proves something even worse, which is that on Mount Rainier, danger can strike, up on the summit like it did for Eric, or it can strike way down in altitude on just an ordinary hike, like what happened with 70-year-old Karen Sykes. Now, don't let Karen's old age fool you. She was actually a legendary writer, photographer, and guidebook expert who had spent decades exploring trails across Washington and the Pacific Northwest. Some of her friends even called her the guru of trails. And being from Seattle, Karen especially loved Mount Rainier. On June 18th, 2014, she and her boyfriend Bob set out on a hike around the Ojai Lakes Trail on the east side of the park. It wasn't a super ambitious summit attempt or like an extremely technical climb. No, it was just a research hike for an article that Karen was planning to write. It was supposed to be safe and simple. However, she was about to find out the hard way that nature isn't really known for being safe or simple, at least not always. As the trail climbed to about 5,000 feet, or roughly 1,524 meters, Karen and Bob reached a little bit of snow. At some point, Karen started to move a little bit faster than Bob, and she told him that she was going to hike ahead briefly and, that she would be right back. And Bob knew that she was the trail expert, and so he had zero problems with this. And you have to understand that Bob didn't see Karen leave the trail or climb away into dense brush. She simply kind of just speed walked up the same trail that they'd been following all day. As she drifted around the next corner, Bob had no clue that his greatest nightmare had just begun. After the two had been separated for a short while, Bob was expecting to catch up to Karen. He hiked from one switchback to the next, checking around tree after tree, but Karen was nowhere to be found. And at first, Bob wondered if she had stepped off the trail for a quick detour, and this wouldn't have been like her, but then again, Karen really loved to spot tiny details that would help add color and value to her outdoor writing. So maybe she spotted a unique tree or a rock formation that she just needed to get a little bit of a closer look at. Well, after several minutes of calling out her name, looking up and down the trail, Bob started to panic. He probably started to think of any logical explanation for why he couldn't find Karen. I mean, he was literally just hiking with her just a few minutes ago. What the hell could have happened? The sun wasn't going to be up forever, and Bob was realizing that he couldn't keep searching all by himself. At this point, he had retraced his steps, hiked up and down the trail, but of course he had found no sign of tracks or any evidence that Karen had maybe fallen off the trail or that something had happened. And so Bob finally rushed back to the trailhead and notified park rangers of the disturbing truth, which was that Karen Sykes was missing. The large search effort began almost immediately. 6 ground crews, 2 dog teams, and a helicopter crew combed the area around Ojai Lakes. And one of the most puzzling parts of this entire disappearance, something that I'm sure all the searchers were thinking about, is that it happened on a well-marked trail in a heavily visited part of the national park. I mean, it is a national park after all, but as we all know, certain parts of certain parks do get a lot of visitors. If Karen had wandered off or been injured or collapsed nearby, crews would have assumed that she'd be found very quickly. And yet, that just wasn't the case here. By the next day, there were still no clues. No gear, no torn clothing, and no obvious signs of struggle or distress. And it's also worth noting that the temperatures that day weren't exactly brutal by any stretch of the imagination, at least for Mount Rainier standards, right? It was just about 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the area. I have a buddy from the Pacific Northwest, and he says that, you know, those temperatures are usually jeans and sweatshirt kind of weather. If you're from the Pacific Northwest, you can let me know if that's what you think as well. Hell, my buddy says he's even worn shorts in those temperatures. And, you know, being from Vermont, I got to admit, I've probably done the same thing. If you're from Florida or southern Arizona, then this might shock you a little bit. But my point here is that it's not like Karen and Bob had been ignoring the forecast or failing to pay attention to big weather shifts. For an experienced hiker, this day was just about as normal as it could possibly get. As the search went on, people began to wonder more and more what could have happened to Karen. I mean, did she run into wildlife when she ventured up the trail all by herself and kind of left her partner behind? Now, Mount Rainier National Park is home to a few predators like mountain lions, coyotes, and black bears. I feel like mountain lions would be the biggest threat of those three, but if she had somehow been attacked, well, they didn't find any blood, any tattered clothing, or any other sign of some sort of attack along the trail. Mountain lions are very stealthy, obviously, but I don't know. I just feel like they most likely would have found something. And you also might be thinking that her disappearance could be linked to foul play somehow. That always comes up. But I do want to note that, again, this was a very popular trail, and there were apparently a lot of people hiking it that day. And since crews didn't find any tracks of any kind, it was very hard for them to even begin to wonder if someone had hurt Karen, despite the fact that there were no signs of a struggle. Theory after theory was thrown around as Bob prayed that he'd find his girlfriend, and as locals desperately searched for their beloved guru of trails. I've covered so many wilderness hiking disappearances on this channel, and not always, but often will say these disappearances happen when people kind of push their limits and go way out on the edge of civilization. But again, Karen wasn't doing any of that. It seemed like she was an expert and she knew her limits really well, but the wilderness clearly doesn't discriminate when it decides to strike. And with that said, on the third day of searching, a crew was retracing Karen's steps along the trail when they peered down a steep, rough slope just off the side of the trail. The slope looked like it was difficult to access and definitely not a part of the official trail, but by this point, crews felt like they'd searched all of the normal places and it was time to start thinking outside of the box. And as they looked down this rugged slope, something down there just looked out of place. The crew members decided to slowly walk down the slope, navigating through brush and rock, and as they approached this unknown object, their hearts completely sank as they realized exactly what they had found. It was, as you probably guessed, a woman's body. They notified authorities immediately, and they were able to extract the body and send it in for autopsy. The Pierce County Medical Examiner's Office determined that the woman had died of hypothermia, and they, of course, tragically identified the body as the guru of the trails herself, Karen Sykes. Now, the hypothermia part might be a little weird to some of you. You might think that it only happens in extreme conditions, you know, up on Mount Everest or whatever. But the truth is that with the strong winds at Karen's altitude and also Karen's age, exposure was a real possibility here. Her death was ultimately ruled accidental, although questions still remain. Did hypothermia cloud her judgment after maybe she took a wrong turn? Is that what happened? Did a medical event slow her down? Or did one wrong step send her down that steep slope, trapping her where rescuers couldn't reach her, and then eventually she died, you know, from exposure to the elements? Karen's story is super tragic, but it is at least somewhat explainable. However, my next story is basically the complete opposite. We've actually talked about Sheila Kearns and the Paradise Inn a long time ago, but to this day, I still find myself thinking about this case, and I'm sure that most of you didn't watch that video or don't remember it. It's been a while. And honestly, I feel like this is one of the like least talked about national park mysteries out there. And so I don't know, I don't think I'd be doing you guys justice or this story justice if I made a video about Mount Rainier mysteries and didn't mention this story. And so by the summer of 1996, Sheila Kearns was 43 years old, and she had just come out of a painful chapter of her life, one that reportedly included supporting her husband through medical school, only for him to then leave her once all the bills were paid off. I mean, that's brutal. Friends and coworkers said that Sheila didn't dwell on these hardships very much, but she also clearly wanted a fresh slate, and that's why she went to work at the Paradise Inn at Mount Rainier National Park. After Sheila's first summer working at the inn, she was one of just a few employees who stayed behind for the winter season. But before she settled in for the winter, she attended an end-of-the-season staff party on October 4th, 1996. Sheila apparently had a good time at the party that night, and by the time that she left, none of her friends or coworkers suspected that it would be the last time they would ever see her alive. 2 days later, Sheila failed to show up for work, and the whole winter staff was immediately on high alert. Now, if you've ever worked a seasonal gig like this, then you know that everyone gets very used to seeing the same faces doing the same things every single day. And so when someone dependable like Sheila doesn't show up for work, well, you immediately know that something is wrong. But when they went to check her room, they didn't find her there. And they also didn't find any notes, any explanation, or any sign of a struggle. The room looked completely normal, like Sheila was fully planning on coming back to it. Oh, and that's the state they found her car in as well. Everything was completely undisturbed. And in hindsight, it's very creepy that everything from her room to her car, that everything looked okay, that everything looked normal, because as we're about to find out, everything was absolutely not okay or normal in this case. After her coworkers couldn't find her anywhere, they of course reported her missing to the authorities. Rangers and search dogs combed the area, initially assuming that Sheila, who was an avid hiker after all, had just gotten lost on a nearby trail. However, after 3 days of searching without finding any trace of her, investigators began to fear something far worse. And so if she didn't just get lost on a hike, then what the hell happened to Sheila Kearns? Was she the victim of an animal attack? Did she decide to just drop everything and run away to start over, maybe in like a more extreme fashion than she had done after her husband left her? Or was the eerie state of her room and her car, were those indications that she was the victim of something much more horrifying? Those questions would just keep hanging in the air because search crews fail to find any answers, anything at all. And so, just like that, the initial search for Sheila was scaled back after a few weeks as the winter weather rolled over Mount Rainier. And just like that, the case literally went cold. But when the snow finally melted the following spring, the park opened back up to reveal what it had been hiding for months. On May 10th, 1997, a park volunteer was walking around the Longmire campground less than a mile from the Paradise Inn. That volunteer thought they were enjoying just a regular spring day in one of America's nicest national parks, but everything changed when they spotted something strange on the ground. It was off-white, and it stood out next to all the brush and sticks that usually covered the ground, especially this time of year. And as this volunteer bent over to inspect the mystery object, their heart sank in their chest because it was a piece of a human skeleton. The volunteer notified authorities immediately, and after crews searched the whole Longmire campground, they ended up finding multiple pieces of skeletal remains scattered all over the place. And so from there, the obvious question was, who do these remains belong to? Now, you probably know where I'm going with this, but you have to remember that so many people have disappeared in Mount Rainier National Park over the years that it was not going to be immediately obvious that these remains belonged to Sheila. They'd only truly be able to get the answers if the remains were brought into a lab, and then science was allowed to give them the final piece of the puzzle. And after those dental and lab records were poured over, the remains, of course, were tragically confirmed to belong to Sheila Kearns. Now, the discovery of Sheila's remains was both heartbreaking and also improbable given how many people go missing here, but it was also extremely scary. And I say that because despite the initial assumptions that her death was an accident, well, authorities would soon announce that her death was definitely not an accident at all. They believed it was the result of homicide. Once they announced this as their leading theory, the FBI took over the investigation because it had occurred within a national park, federal land. Multiple people were interviewed, but no one was charged throughout the entire investigation. And once again, even after the huge breakthrough of finding the remains in the first place, Sheila's case slipped into total silence. And nearly 3 decades later, the unanswered questions still haunt this story. How did Sheila's remains go undiscovered during the initial search? That's a question that I have, especially because they were found so close to the Paradise Inn at a well-used campground and well-used park buildings. That's something that's always stuck out to me about this case. Like, it's not like they found her miles and miles into the backcountry where nobody goes. They found her pretty close to the place that she worked. Like, one of the first places they would have searched, right? And so do we think that the authorities were correct and that Sheila truly was the victim of a crime? Or could an animal attack explain the way that her remains were scattered all around and maybe hidden for a while? And if not, if it was foul play, then how did someone manage to commit this horrible crime in such a popular national park and then get away with it? I'm telling you guys, not that many people talk about this case, and it's just so strange and tragic. I think more people need to hear it. And so my heart goes out to Sheila and her family. And if somehow you have any information about this case, please contact the FBI as soon as you possibly can. Now, Sheila's story is very underreported in my opinion, but this next story is actually even more underreported. In fact, I didn't find any other videos about this story on YouTube. I definitely could have missed something, but at least when I looked, it seems like this might be the first time that it's ever been discussed, at least at length on YouTube. In 1999, William Trey's T-Gen was 28 years old and he was ready to take on the world. He had just become a doctor and was now days away from starting his residency in internal medicine at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Washington. Adventure had always been a part of Trey's life. He loved to kayak through raging rivers. He loved to climb 19,000-foot peaks. And he bragged that he once survived a bandit attack while hiking in Ecuador. And so by any measure, Trey's was basically half cowboy and half superhero. On June 20th, he traveled to Mount Rainier to snowboard near Camp Muir, which is a high elevation hub at roughly 10,000 feet in elevation, or that's around 3,000 meters. And this hub attracts climbers and winter athletes year round. Again, this is a winter-ish story that took place in the summer. Now, Trey's plan was to hike up to Camp Muir with his snowboard in hand. And when he left the trailhead in the afternoon, conditions were already less than ideal. Not like abysmal, but, overcast skies, temperatures around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light drizzle of cold rain. However, Trey's wasn't gonna let a little bad weather get in the way of a really good adventure, but I do wonder if he'd change his mind if he had known what was about to happen. After trudging up the mountain, Trey's finally reached the public shelter at Camp Muir right around 5:15 p.m. It had been a long hike up, but he was excited to finally get to, the real reason he did this, to snowboard back down. When he was at Camp Muir, a ranger actually talked to him and warned him that the fog was starting to roll in. Tracks around the shelter were starting to disappear, and this ranger thought that the weather was only going to get worse. And so he actually invited Trey's to join a group of hikers that were about to head back down so that they could all go down together just in case the storm were to get any more dangerous. However, Trey's reportedly wasn't interested in this. And so after spending about 15 minutes at the shelter, he hopped onto his snowboard and he started to shred down all by himself. Now, again, Trey's was an avid outdoorsman. He definitely had a lot of experience, but I do need to note here that he wasn't that familiar with Rainier's terrain. And to add another scary part to this whole story, well, Trey's had only been snowboarding for about a year. And on top of that, he wasn't really carrying that much gear with him. He didn't have a down jacket or extra cold layers or a tent or a sleeping bag or crampons. He basically didn't have any of the gear that you'd hope an inexperienced snowboarder would have when the weather starts to turn bad when you're high on a mountain like this. From Camp Muir, the mountain naturally slopes down west toward the Nisqually Glacier, and local rangers have said that it can be a real challenge whenever someone is skiing or snowboarding down from there. It's hard for me to describe this because I've never done it. All I did was read about it, but apparently you would need to angle east, almost like you're going uphill, to avoid being pulled towards cliffs and ice falls. I don't know. I think the simplest way to describe it would be the mountain is trying to pull you towards danger, and you have to do everything in your power to go the opposite way. And in foggy conditions, that can be a challenge even for the most experienced snowboarders, which Trey's was definitely not. Just before this adventure, Trey's parents had actually driven with him to Seattle. However, they didn't join him on the mountain, and they instead decided to go explore Vancouver, British Columbia. And while they enjoyed this fun international West Coast trip, they assumed that their son was out there having a great time on the mountain. They would have had no idea that what was happening on those slopes was about to change their lives forever. As the sun went down over Mount Rainier, rangers at the Paradise Ranger Station kept expecting Trey's to check back in with them at the bottom of the mountain. But the weather was only getting worse, and Trey's never showed up. The ranger who spoke with Trey's up at Camp Muir remembered wanting him to just hike down safely with the rest of the group, and this ranger began to worry if that was going to be one of the last conversations that Trey's would ever have. And so once Trey's failed to make it to the bottom of the mountain, like for good, search and rescue teams were dispatched, and they were dispatched almost immediately. And yet, despite this quick response, weather conditions were obviously very hazardous, and crews searched more than 12 square miles of terrain over the course of several days without making much progress at all. And while all of this was happening, you can probably imagine that the theories began to run wild. Now, it was pretty unlikely that Trey's would have run into some kind of wildlife out there, since this was like a steep ski slope and most animals would probably prefer to hunker down and wait out bad weather. But then again, at this point, I've covered so many of these stories that I can't ever rule out 100% that animals weren't involved. Trey's had also gotten a very late start that day. And again, it was the summer, and so the sun wouldn't go down until later on in the evening, but still, he didn't leave Camp Muir until a little after 5 p.m., and that didn't leave much daylight out there for him at all. And so, did he get lost out there in the dark? Certainly a possibility. And then there was the fact that Trey's wasn't actually that experienced of a snowboarder, and we know that the route down the mountain was a little trickier and included some treacherous cliffs. So maybe the mountain pulled him in the wrong direction and he injured himself, or worse. There's also the very real possibility that he experienced just a normal fall or injury while snowboarding in the first place. I mean, that's not exactly uncommon even on the easiest green runs at the easiest ski resorts, let alone on a place like Mount Rainier in the backcountry. And so if this did happen, God forbid, then he would have been all alone in the dark, in bad weather, and definitely could have suffered from exposure. The search crews were just kind of running through different scenarios in their heads, and as hard as it is to say this, the same thing was happening for Trey's parents. They worked tirelessly to try to find their son or any possible clue along the side of the mountain, but by the time that the search was starting to wind down, they had found absolutely nothing. And this is strange, right? They didn't find any snowboard or any tracks, certainly no body, and also no clear indication of where Trey's had gone. Eventually, with worsening weather and no new leads, the search was suspended, as always happens at some point in these cases. And when this happened, William Trey's Tejan was added to the long list of people who had disappeared on Mount Rainier without any solid explanation. Snow kept falling on the mountain as 1999 was an unusually intense winter. It seemed like if there were any answers left on the mountain, they were almost certainly buried under layers and layers of ice and snow by this point. Trey's parents held a memorial service 2 years later, basically having accepted that the mountain had taken their son and his bright future. However, that very same year, 2001 at this point, something unbelievable happened. Two climbers had just recently disappeared near the edge of the Nisqually Glacier, and when rangers were out searching for them, they noticed something strange. The search team was currently at about 5,800 feet or 1,800 meters of elevation when one of the crew members had been taking a moment to observe a nearby waterfall that was running out of the glacier. He looked from the top of the waterfall and his eyes followed the flow all the way down to the water below, and that's when he saw an unknown object at the bottom of the waterfall. Now again, they're out here searching for an unrelated case, and so at first it seemed like this might be a clue that could lead to the two missing climbers, or maybe it was something else entirely. And so this crew member looked down to get a closer look, and right there at the bottom of this glacial waterfall, he found something horrifying. Human remains. You need to understand though that as unsettling as this discovery might sound, it was actually like even more unsettling for this particular crew member because the remains didn't appear to belong to the two climbers that they were out there searching for. Instead, the ice had seemed to have been holding onto these remains for far longer, maybe even like years longer. And so sensing that this discovery pointed to a much older mystery, the search crews started looking around the site for any more clues, and that's when they uncovered a single piece of equipment half buried nearby, and this changed everything. It was a snowboard. It took nearly a dozen rangers more than 3 hours to remove the waterlogged remains and all of the gear out of the ice and snow, and finally deliver it to the Pierce County Medical Examiner's office. From there, the autopsy would eventually help identify the body as belonging to William Trey's TGen. As unlikely as it seems, it turns out that the glacier had held on to Trey's body for 2 years, and it took a little bit of movement, melting, and a waterfall to finally move things around enough to reveal the secrets that had been buried within the mountain, frozen in time, essentially. And thankfully, the two climbers that the rangers were originally searching for out there were later found alive and well, which is awesome, but it's just tragic that Trey's wasn't as lucky as they were. Trey's had survived some wild places, but on that fateful solo snowboarding trip, the icy mountain got the last word, and it pretty much always will. My heart goes out to Trey's as well as everyone else that I talked about in this video. Please show all of them some love in the comments, guys, and I just appreciate all of you. I mean, it's just such a blessing to be able to tell you these stories, to help people stay safer on their adventures. It's not always easy. Like, these stories are very, very sad and hard to tell sometimes, honestly, but I don't know. I think we're doing a good thing here, and it wouldn't be possible without all of you. So thank you very much. And if you liked this video, YouTube thinks that you're going to like this one next. And so give it a click, and thank you all so much for watching.